Here we go. We're looking at session number 91. We're working towards 100 sessions in Mark, folks. We're looking today at a title, Golgotha, which of course is the place of the cross. What are we going to look at? Well, we're going to look at the same chapters again, Mark 15, Matthew 27, Luke 23, and John 19, in trying to put together everything that we can. Interestingly, about 30% of the Gospels are focused in the last week of Christ's life. There were very few times up until the Passion Week, up until the triumphal entry, there were very few times when all four Gospels came into play on one event, on the same event. But in the Passion Week, there is a strong increase in the number of times that a given event saw all four Gospel writers responding and giving their input, their remembrance, and so forth. Well, that's where we are today. Mark, Matthew, Luke, John all have something to say about Golgotha. In our next session, we'll have everything to say about Jesus on the cross, Jesus' death. So the next three times, we're going to continue to have all four gospel writers participating. Couple questions. Pilate had made his decision. So what happened next? That's our focus today. Did Jesus have anything to say on the way to Golgotha? We know that he was assigned the task of carrying the crossbeam, but then that wasn't as far as it went because of how badly he had been beaten up in the abuses leading to his march to Golgotha. As he was led away, Jesus appeared to have been fully clothed, more clothing than he would have on the cross, where he would be naked or nearly so. I'm going to begin with Mark, verse 20 of chapter 15. Mark writes us this: when they had finished mocking him, that's Jesus, of course, they stripped him of the purple cloak. Remember, they put the crown of thorns on his head and the purple robe. And Pilate paraded him out, trying one more time to get the Jews to buy in the flogging that he had undergone and allow him to release Jesus in freedom. Mark goes on, and he put his own clothes back on him, so he was wearing his usual clothing. Then they led him away to crucify him. The response of unbelievers to mock Jesus. That's all right. The religious elite did the same thing. The Roman soldiers did the same thing. So why not the typical Jew who does not believe in Jesus? Why wouldn't you expect that that person would continue the mocking and so forth? John tells us that Jesus, as was usual in those matters, had the crossbeam, or the patibulum, P-A-T-I-B-U-L-U-M in Latin, weighing from 40 to 100 pounds. He had it laid on his torn up back. Remember, his back is hanging in shreds of flesh. But it was on his back and shoulders, and he was led out. Here's what John tells us in 19:17. And carrying his own cross beam, he went out to the place called the place of the skull, in Aramaic, Golgotha. So that's not even a Hebrew term. It is an Aramaic term, which is close to Hebrew, but was the language spoken in Israel as a native language at this time. Then let's move to Luke 23:26. Luke 23:26. As they led him away, they, assume that's the Roman soldiers accompanying Jesus to the cross, they seized Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country. They placed the cross on his back and made him carry it behind Jesus. So Simon, with the crossbeam on his back, is following behind Jesus, who is walking or marching to Golgotha. Simon was likely a Jew from North Africa. He may have been black, as a lot of people believe, but he more likely was not a black man. Not that that has anything to do with the story. It's just to make it clear that there is no indication he was black. And he came to Jerusalem for the Passover celebration and got a little more activity when he got there. He was probably, as I said, not a black man, as some have surmised. Cyrene, well, it's an important coastal city of North Africa, that would be on the Mediterranean, and it had a large Jewish population. Simon was probably a member of that Jewish community. Do Luke and John contradict each other in who carried Jesus' 100-pound crossbar? Doubt it. Likely Jesus began carrying the crossbar, and when the earlier beatings took their toll, Simon was then forced to take over. So Jesus probably started and was relieved by Simon along the way. Well, I'm reading from Mark again, verse 21. He was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Remember, Mark's writing for the Roman Church, which would have known Alexander and Rufus. Paul told them about it talked about that in Romans 16:13, which says, greet, he's writing to the Roman Church, of course, greet Rufus, a choice man in the Lord, and his mother and mine. In Genesis 22, verses 1 to 6, many people see a foretaste of Jesus carrying the crossbar in Isaac's carrying the wood to the place where Abraham expected to sacrifice him. If you remember back, they went for a while with some slaves or servants, and at some point he said, you guys stay here, Isaac and I are going to go on to sacrifice, and Isaac carried the wood for the sacrifice. He was to be a burnt offering, remember. So some see that when Isaac carried that wood up to his own offering as a sacrifice to God, a burnt sacrifice to God, some see that as a foretaste in some way of Christ being followed by Simon as he carried the crossbeam. I think that's a bit of a stretch myself. And here's Genesis 22:6. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac. Then he took the fire and the knife in his hand, and the two of them walked on together to the sacrifice site. It's also significant that Jesus was led outside the walls of the camp, where by law the unpleasant parts of the sin sacrifice were to be burned. Now, I don't know if that excites you either, but there it is, a connection. And then in Exodus 29:14, we see this: but the flesh of the bull and its hide and its refuse you shall burn with fire outside the camp. It is, after all, is my own addition, a sin offering. Christ was a sin offering for our sin, and he was executed on Golgotha outside the walls of Jerusalem. Simon wasn't the only person following along with Jesus, though. Let's read about that in Luke 23:27. A great number of the people, and that's Luke's term for people sympathetic to Jesus, a great number of the people followed him, among them women who were mourning and wailing for him. In spite of all that has happened, Jesus, always aware of the needs of others, still had enough energy and compassion, in spite of the beatings he had taken, to give those following a word of warning, and that we see in Luke 23, verses 28, 29, 30, and 31. But Jesus turned to them, the women, and said, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children, for this is certain, that days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren, the wombs that never bore children, and the breasts that never nursed. In verse 30, then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if such things are done when the wood is green, what will happen when it's dry? In other words, he said there's going to come a day when it's going to be even worse than what you see now. So compare Jesus' words, they were prophecy really, with a prophecy from Hosea speaking of judgment on the northern kingdom of Israel. And this was a few years before the nation Israel as a kingdom, the northern kingdom, as a separate physical and a political unit, disappeared. It never will be again until there is a recollection of both halves, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. At some time, God will restore the whole nation of Israel. But in the meantime, in Hosea 10, verses 1, 3, and 8, says this: Israel was a fertile vine that yielded fruit. As his fruit multiplied, here's what happened then: he multiplied altars to Baal. As his land prospered, they adorned the fertility pillars. Very soon they will say, we have no king, since we do not fear the Lord. But what can a king do for us anyway? That was God saying, here Israel began life as a fruitful nation, doing what I set up for it to do. But as things went along, things got much, much worse. It continued in verse 8, the high places of the house of wickedness will be destroyed. He's still talking about Israel. It is the place where Israel, the northern kingdom, sins. Thorns and thistles will grow up over its altars. They will say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. In other words, it's going to be so bad, they want to be covered over and immune from it. Jesus is likely saying that if the Jews will crucify the Messiah now, when the wood is green, what will it be like when judgment comes to Israel when the wood is dry? In terms of Jerusalem, that would be probably AD 70, the first go-around. But if it wasn't Jerusalem, but was the northern kingdom, then that happened many hundreds of years earlier when she was destroyed by Assyria. Look at Ezekiel 20:47, at least the last part of the verse. Hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I'm about to start a fire in you, and it will devour every green tree and every dry tree in you. The flaming fire will not be extinguished, and the whole surface of the ground from the Negev to the north will be scorched by it. And that would be covering all of Judah at least, if not all the way north to Dan on the north. Then the group arrived at the crucifixion site. We have all these people following along, Simon following Jesus. There were some other criminals going also. But they're coming to the crucifixion site now. Crucifixions, like burials, had to be performed outside the city walls. The Jews could not tolerate it and execution inside the city walls. Let's go back and look at what Matthew says about this at this point in time, verses 33 and 34. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull, and offered Jesus wine mixed with gall to drink. But after tasting it, he would not drink it. The drink was intended as a painkiller, not as an intoxicant. But Jesus said, no, I've got to suffer the whole time. Jesus did not have the strength to resist anything anyone wanted to do to him. But the drink that was offered was intended to numb his pain. Again, it's likely a mixture of myrrh as a narcotic. But that's probably why Jesus tasted the drink before refusing it. It was probably put to his lips before he could react. Remember, the soldiers all around him as the escort to Golgotha. Jesus evidently, still suffering, folks. Jesus evidently wanted to go through the ordeal with all his senses intact. The Romans did it, gave him a drink like that, to lengthen the torture time on the cross, and therefore overall increase the pain and the level of punishment. It was Friday, probably around noon, the 6th hour by Jewish reckoning. At noon on the day of preparation for the Passover lambs were being prepared for sacrifice in the temple during a 2-hour window. At that same time, the Son of God was being sacrificed. At the crucifixion site, they would have nailed Jesus to the cross with arms laying outward along the crossbeam. Nails were put through the hands or the wrist. A rope was generally placed around the chest and vertical posts to hold the victim relatively upright. They didn't want him just hanging and suffocating too quickly. On the vertical post there would be a peg to act as a seat, not for comfort, but again to extend the pain and time of the crucifixion before death. The victim would be stripped naked or with a simple loincloth. The feet would be nailed together sideways into the vertical post. The body would be twisting about 90 degrees at the waist. So nothing comfortable in any way, shape, or form, just enough to cause the individual to last longer than he would have elsewhere. Next session, we're going to look at how those present treated Jesus and his response to them. So, here we go. Next time, we will see the elements of the crucifixion with Jesus there in the middle. See you then.